Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show. I thought I'd start today's show by talking once again about the elites. Who are the people who rule us? Well, I suppose you could look to see the people who get what they want, regardless of the circumstances. I am reading from a story from CNBC. NASDAQ 100 touches record before retreating. Stocks were lower on Thursday, giving back some of the strong gains for June as Wall Street grappled with disappointing jobs data, you don't say, and a late day sell-off in tech shares. Earlier in the session, the NASDAQ 100 index, which is made up of the 100 largest non-financial stocks in the NASDAQ composite, hit an intraday record. From February 19th to March 23rd, the NASDAQ 100 plummeted more than 30%. Since then, however, the index has skyrocketed more than 40%. So let's review the bidding, shall we? We had a situation where there was obviously an equities bubble that had been getting larger and larger and larger for many years now. And then we get a virus from China, COVID-19, which closes down the United States and wrecks the economy, puts many, many millions out of work. And then, as this is all dying down, although in some places they're still insisting on the lockdown, like New York and Pennsylvania, America's cities are set on fire, with doubtless trillions of dollars of damage, and yet the stock market goes up, up, up. And what does that tell me? It tells me that the money men run the world. Now, Niccolo Machiavelli knew that the world is run by elites, and I'm going to quote again from James Burnham's book, The Machiavellians. Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. He wanted independence for Italy, and his political writings, particularly The Prince, were a set of instructions to Italian princes on how to bring about Italian independence. Now, at the end of Burnham's book, he writes, I shall now summarize the main principles of Machiavellianism, those principles which are common to all Machiavellians and which taken together define Machiavellianism as a distinctive tradition of political thought. These general principles constitute a way of looking at social life, an instrument for social and political analysis. They are capable of being applied concretely in the study of any historical period, including our own, that may interest us. They are to be found implicit as a rule in the writings of Machiavelli himself. The modern Machiavellians, with a vastly increased number of historical facts at their disposal, have explicitly formulated them. Number one, an objective science of politics and of society comparable in its methods to the other empirical sciences is possible. Such a science will describe and correlate observable social facts, and on the basis of the facts of the past will state more or less probable hypotheses about the future. Such a science will be neutral with respect to any practical political goal. That is, like any other science, its statements will be tested by facts accessible to any observer, rich or poor, ruler or ruled, and will in no way be dependent upon the acceptance of some particular ethical aim or ideal. Contrary views hold that a science of politics is not possible because of the peculiarity of human nature, or for some similar reason, or that political analysis is always dependent upon some practical program for the improvement or destruction of society, or that any political science must be a class science, true for the bourgeoisie, but not for the proletariat, as, for example, the Marxists claim. 2, the primary subject matter of political science is the struggle for social power in its diverse, open, and concealed forms. Contrary views hold that political thought deals with the general welfare, the common good, and other such entities that are from time to time invented by the theorists. 3, The laws of political life cannot be discovered by an analysis which takes men's words and beliefs, spoken or written, at their face value. Words, programs, declarations, constitutions, laws, theories, philosophies must be related to the whole complex of social facts in order to understand their real political and historical meaning. The contrary view pays chief attention to words, believing that what men say they are doing or propose to do or have done is the best evidence for what they actually do. 4. Logical or rational action plays a relatively minor part in political and social change. For the most part, it is a delusion to believe that in social life, men take deliberate steps to achieve consciously held goals. Non-logical action, spurred by environmental changes, instinct, impulse, interest, is the usual social rule. 5. For an understanding of the social process, the most significant social division to be recognized is that between the ruling class and the ruled, between the elite and the non-elite. 6. Historical and political science is above all the study of the elite, its composition, its structure, and the mode of its relation to the non-elite. 7. The primary object of every elite or ruling class is to maintain its own power and privilege. The contrary view holds that the primary object of the rulers is to serve the community. This view is almost invariably held by all spokesmen for an elite, at least with respect to the elite for which they are speaking. Among such spokesmen are to be numbered almost all of those who write on political and social matters. 8. The rule of the elite is based upon force and fraud. The force may, to be sure, be much of the time hidden or only threatened, and the fraud may not entail any conscious deception. 9. The social structure as a whole is integrated and sustained by a political formula, which is usually correlated with a generally accepted religion, ideology, or myth. 10. The rule of an elite will coincide now more, now less with the interests of the non-elite. Thus, in spite of the fact that the primary object of every elite is to maintain its own power and privilege, there are nevertheless real and significant differences in social structures from the point of view of the masses. These differences, however, cannot be properly evaluated in terms of formal meanings, verbalisms, and ideologies, but by A, the strength of the community in relation to other communities, B, the level of civilization reached by the community, its ability, that is to say, to release a wide variety of creative interests and to attain a high measure of material and cultural advance, and C, liberty, that is, the security of individuals against the arbitrary and irresponsible exercise of power. 11. Two opposing tendencies always operate in the case of every elite. A, an aristocratic tendency whereby the elite seeks to preserve the ruling position of its members and their descendants, and to prevent others from entering its ranks. And B, a democratic tendency whereby new elements force their way into the elite from below. 12. In the long run, the second of these tendencies always prevails. From this, it follows that no social structure is permanent and no static utopia is possible. The social or class struggle always continues, and its record is history. 13. There occur periodically very rapid shifts in the composition and structure of elites, that is, social revolutions. It may be remarked that these Machiavellian principles are much closer to the more or less instinctive views of practical men, who are themselves active in the social struggle, than to the views of theorists, reformers, and philosophers. That is natural because the principles are simply the generalized statement of what practical men do and have been doing, whereas the theorists, most often comparatively isolated from direct participation in the social struggle, are able to imagine society and its laws to be as they would wish to have them. Now, he goes on to talk about his earlier book, The Managerial Revolution, and then says, from a Machiavellian point of view, a social revolution means a comparatively rapid shift in the composition and structure of the elite and in the mode of its relation to the non-elite. It is possible to state the conditions under which such a rapid shift takes place. The principle of these conditions are the following. 1. When the institutional structure and the elite which has the ruling position within this structure are unable to handle possibilities opened up by technological advances and by the growth, for whatever reason, of new social forces. 2, when a considerable percentage of the ruling class devotes little attention to the business of ruling and turns its interest to such fields as culture, art, philosophy, and the pursuit of sensuous pleasure. 3, when an elite is unable or unwilling to assimilate rising new elements from the masses or from its own lower ranks. 4, when large sections of the elite lose confidence in themselves and the legitimacy of their own rule, and when in both elite and non-elite there is a loss of faith in the political formulas and myths that have held the social structure together. 5, when the ruling class, or much of it, is unable or unwilling to use force in a firm and determined way, and instead tries to rely almost exclusively on manipulation, compromise, deceit, and fraud. You see how much this is relevant to what we are going through now? When the ruling class is unable or unwilling to use force in a firm and determined way. That is exactly what we are going through now, and it can be witnessed on the streets of America. When large sections of the elite lose confidence in themselves and the legitimacy of their own rule. Well, I just saw a video of the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, kneeling before the coffin of George Floyd, and he was blubbing like a child. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, he is the mayor, and there is a black police chief, and the attorney general of Minnesota is black, etc., etc., etc. You see this loss of confidence in themselves when the considerable percentage of the ruling class devotes little attention to the business of ruling. But we see this everywhere. Our ruling class doesn't seem to be particularly interested in this. They seem to hold a quasi-Marxist view that the future has been mapped out. And so there's little reason for them to get their hands dirty. Now, what we are seeing now on the streets of America is that a group of people who is not part of the ruling class are demanding to enter the ruling class. These are the black radicals. And such has been the success of their efforts, often violent efforts, is that it appears quite likely, quite probable, that they are in fact going to be admitted to the elite at a very high level. And I will talk about that, some indications of this a little later. But again, politics can only be understood in terms of oligarchy, in terms of elite and non-elite. If our rulers, particularly the rulers of the United States, had any particular interest in the people they ostensibly govern, they would not have allowed America's cities to go up in flames. Clearly, they are frightened, but some of them also hold a more cynical view that the sacking of America will somehow redound to their advantage. And it may well do so in the short term. It may well result in the defeat of Trump in November. But the long-term consequences of the sacking of America are absolutely disastrous to the elite. Because the elite they have not exactly promised a utopia, but something close to it, which is progress ever after. That society as a whole and the individual countries, states, cities, etc., are constantly progressing. What we have seen in America latterly is a monstrous regression. Now, you note that the elite has been quick to deny the actual facts which people see with their eyes. Oh, these are peaceful protests. Oh, all this talk about looting is completely untoward and racist. Well, everyone has seen the pictures, dozens or hundreds or thousands of pictures and videos of the destruction and looting. But the media understands that these pictures are disastrous to their legitimacy. So on the one hand, they are trying to deny them, but on the other hand, they are already making efforts to include the non-elite, that is to say, the black radicals in the elite structure, and to incorporate demands of the black radicals in their progressive program. So let's take a look at the chat. Let's see what's going on there. I'll mention that someone suggested, it could have been the chat yesterday, that one of the ways to get around the sound problem I have with my computer is to get a USB sound card. That was an excellent suggestion. I have looked into it, and I believe I should probably be able to procure one tomorrow. Unfortunately, that means that there is not going to be a Theater Thursday today. But next Thursday, I will talk about Fassbinder's The Marriage of Maria Brown. But there will be a book club tomorrow, and I will be discussing Timothy Weiner's excellent book, Legacy of Ashes. William Hicks says on NPR today, a reporter from NYC kept repeating peaceful protests, not just marches or protests. At the same time, she described a level of mayhem. Well, you know, I've talked often enough about the cognitive dissonance, which holds such great sway over our elite. And they are attempting for us to internalize the same cognitive dissonance. No, you may see looting, you may see rioting, you may see destruction, even of churches, but no, these are not riots, and it's completely inappropriate or worse to describe them as such. Hicks continues, broken windows, women getting hit, peaceful. New York City is going into the 9th day of protests and curfew. YT, KMG, what do you think about today's Corbett video, Corbett report video? I have not seen it. I will write it down. Keep in mind. Oh, he puts transcripts of his videos, I believe. So yes, I can get the I can get it without hearing the sound. Okay, Choginkin 666. Someone didn't get the memo. COVID is passé. We've now pivoted to mass gatherings are okay. Well, that strange person who is the chief medical officer of Pennsylvania apparently was saying that mass protests are okay, but the lockdown is still on. This is cognitive dissonance at its finest. Jonathan Pohl says BLM is now proposing Haiti in 1804 as their preferred model. Yes, whether America will be reconsecrated to the devil is, I suppose, an open question. Walrus Libertarian says racism trumps all other concerns always. Well, you see, I spoke of Georges Sorel yesterday in The Power of Myth. You see the myth that the Marxists talked about class. Well, the revolutionaries talk about race or racism. Of course, at the same time, they refer to racialized people or even racialized property. You see, race is rather like Schrödinger's cat. It doesn't exist, but it does exist at the same time. And that is a pretty neat trick to pull off. Coachalango says, what is KMG reading again? I was reading from part 7 of James Burnham's The Machiavellians. YT says the population has been sufficiently idiotized. It's been long in the making. Recall KMG saying last night how the newspapers had much more intellectually challenging content. Again, if you want to go back to the so-called golden age of TV and look at the sort of things, I mean, you had your sitcoms and you had comedy programs, but the level, the intellectual level of discourse on television across the board was greatly higher, say in the 1940s and the 1950s, than it is today. I mean, I was thinking about this today. If you watch Warner Brothers and MGM cartoons from the 1930s to the 1950s, keep in mind these cartoons were made for adults, they weren't made for children. You find all of these references to literature, both current literature and classic literature. You find all of these references to classical music, to Wagner, Liszt, etc., etc. And it was assumed that the viewers of this would understand the references. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been put in, or there wouldn't have been so many of them. Choco King 666, they need to go full Chile. Yeah, I don't see that happening. And I guess Chile got a respite, but it didn't in the long term. Look at what's been going on in Chile over the last year. It hasn't worked out very well. Adam says Machiavellianism comes from a place of lost faith. It's true that Machiavelli's books were condemned by the Index. He did die within the church. Okay, let's see. George Floyd. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the full autopsy results regarding this fellow. You know, it's one thing to say that his death was needless, but it's another to keep up the narrative that he got his life back together. He had very much not got his life back together, but that's going to be the narrative. John Miller says, check out his other book, Suicide of the West. Yes, there's a new edition that came out that I talked about, on Luke Ford's, the old book club on Luke Ford's show. That is to do specifically with liberalism, that Burnham identified liberalism as the motivating force behind the suicide of the West, and he's obviously correct about that. Manfred von Thistlebaum says, anyone seen the video of the naked guy attacking people on the sidewalk? Well, I've heard about it. Metal Mike says that was my first exposure to classical Looney Tunes. That was many people's first exposure to classical music. Phlegmatica said yesterday a viral tweet from Black Twitter enjoined us to imagine music without Black people. Our household doesn't need to imagine. It's blissful. Okay, so let's go back to it here. I mentioned Saul Alinsky yesterday and his rules, his 13 rules for radicals. And I wanted to repeat number 4. Make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. Well, right up near the top, this week, in the enemy's book of rules, is that Black people must be made whole. That they've suffered and they've suffered and they've continued to suffer, and it's time for the suffering to end, and that white people must give them what they deserve. You know, affirmative action and all the rest of it is not enough. There must be more. Now, the kneeling and the groveling and the literal kissing of boots that we have seen in the last week, those are just gestures. They're powerful gestures, but they're just gestures. And a few things have come to mind. Size E Cup on CNN has been groveling up a storm. And yes, this all lives matter business, it must end. It's hateful. And listen to the Black people. The Black people must get what they want. And she had someone called Dante Stallworth on her show. I asked my friend to do most of the talking so I could do the listening. I responded to her, there is no shortage of bottled blondes on cable news. If you really support Black Lives Matter, resign your job and insist that CNN hire a Black woman to replace you. Anything else is rank hypocrisy. And I think we should be pushing this very, very strongly. Oh, Black people aren't properly represented in the media, then quit. Quit your job and demand that your space go to a Black person. It's something that they could do. All of the rich people who've been carrying on about, oh, the Black people need this, the Black people need this, and they throw in some money. No, if this is to be a religion, let's treat it like Christianity. Give up everything you have. Give up everything you have. That will prove that you are on the way to salvation, because they all admit that they're all still racist themselves, that racism is incurable, that it's a virus for which there is no vaccine. So give up everything you have to the poor. Another conservative, Madeline Fry, she tweeted yesterday, back at the DC Examiner website this morning to write about why I no longer say all lives matter. I responded, I, for one, welcome our new BLM overlords. I'd like to remind them that as a trusted conservative media personality, I can be helpful in forcing whites to stay on their knees forever. And again, everyone like S.E. Cupp or Madeline Fry, it should be put to them, you have a comfortable life. You are wealthy. You've had your days in the sun. Resign, step aside, and let the Black people take over, because anything else is less. Anything less than that is rank hypocrisy. And one more story in that regard. The truly terrifying mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, pleads with Walmart, other retailers not to abandon Chicago. Mayor Lightfoot said she's hopeful major retailers will reopen the Chicago stores that were looted or otherwise damaged during protests surrounding George Floyd's killing by police in Minnesota, but she's unsure of one of the biggest. Walmart has said that it is going to reopen some stores, but would not say which ones. Now, my initial view was, and I'm sure this is shared by many people who listen to this stream or on the what you might call the dissident right, that they burn down the stores, let them live with it. Let them live with their mess. But then I was thinking, Walmart is not our friend. Walmart destroys communities. I think that Walmart should be bullied into reopening every single one of their stores. And if it gets burned down again, then they're going to have to build it up again. Doesn't matter how many times this happens. Is Walmart committed to Black Lives Matter or what? Now, they know about the very high levels of theft from these stores, but that is just the cost of showing your commitment to Black Lives Matters. And do we dare talk of theft when we're talking about Black communities? Isn't this people taking reparations into their own hands, and quite rightly so? We hear from the elite that women are not properly represented in corporate culture, that the glass ceiling still very much exists. And of course, people of color not properly represented, especially female people of color and female people of color who happen to be trans women. I mean, the list goes on and on. Let's, I took some of this from recent discussions from Monterey Peninsula College. Let's force them to take their words, going back to Machiavelli and his distinction between the formal meaning of words and the real meaning. Well, if you really mean it, let's have 50% of the people on TV be Black. Okay, but they're only 13% of the population. Oh, I see. What about the legacy of slavery? What about redlining? What about the systemic discrimination that exists today? No, I'm afraid you're going to have to make heroic efforts. We want all of the straight white men removed from corporate governance. Okay? Because you say it's an iniquitous system. Well, okay, then act on those beliefs. Act on them or shut the hell up. And perhaps this could be formalized through legislation. The time for believing that the other side plays by any rules, that the other side is interested in anything but power and wealth, those days are over. And I'm afraid this year has proved it to anyone who didn't understand it previously. The fight must be taken to the enemy. All of this talk about the Constitution or fairness or double standards, to hell with that. That is loser talk. And just keep in mind how very high the stakes are now. Because, I mean, the gloves are truly off now. And, you know, maybe we're going to have a military coup in the United States. There was a book that came out, a novel in 1962, and it was called 7 Days in May, and it was written by Fletcher Neville and Charles W. Bailey II, and it was an enormous bestseller. It was made into a movie by the great John Frankenheimer in 1964, and it's considered one of the three parts of his Paranoia trilogy, the other two being Seconds and the Manchurian Candidate. But the plot is that top generals in the United States have come to the conclusion that the president is a traitor and his administration is traitorous because it wants to seek peace negotiations with the Soviet Union. So they mount a coup attempt against the president. Star-studded, this movie was Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, Frederick March, Ava Gardner. And the generals are the bad guys, you see, because not only is the president democratically elected, but peace is a good thing, isn't it? Now, if we look at the generals who are coming out against Trump, they don't seem to believe in democracy. And they are committed to forever wars. They are just outraged that Trump does not intend to waste American life and treasure forever, for 300 years, as Max Boot said, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, etc. And the generals have this terrible fear, this paralyzing fear that Trump may eventually come to a modus vivendi with Russia, because you know, a lot of these generals, they go into the private sector after they leave office, and they become very rich, working with military contractors. A near state of war means money in their pocket. But again, it would appear that 7 Days in May is being remade in 2020, but this time the traitors are the good guys. This is from Breitbart. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis published an attack on Trump on Wednesday, accusing the president of violating the Constitution in clearing Lafayette Park on Monday and using the military to quell riots. In an extraordinary statement published in The Atlantic, Mattis calls the rioters and looters, quote, a small number of lawbreakers, unquote, among tens of thousands of people of conscience who are insisting that we live up to our values. He also compares President Trump to a Nazi, saying Trump's policies resemble, quote, the Nazi slogan for destroying us, unquote. He does not call for any specific action, but suggests the president should be rejected. Quote, when I joined the military some 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstances to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside. I'm just going to break in to say here, some of you might remember that Michelle Obama, when her husband was president, decided to make a visit to Washington's farmer's market, which was, I don't know, a block or two from the White House. And she took pretty much the equivalent of an army brigade with her to provide security. Mad Dog continues, at home, we should use our military only when requested to do so on very rare occasions by state governors. Militarizing our response, as witnessed in Washington, D.C., sets up conflict, a false conflict between the military and civilian society. Again, I'm going to break in to say that amongst liberals, President Eisenhower, is perhaps the most heroic thing he ever did, was to send the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to force the integration of the schools at bayonet point. Now, I'm sure Mattis understands this. He continues, instructions given by the military departments to our troops before the Normandy invasion reminded soldiers that, quote, the Nazi slogan for destroying us was divide and conquer. Our American answer is, in union there is strength. We must summon that unity to surmount this crisis, confident that we are better than our politics. Is that what really happened? Just before D-Day, they were talking about divide and conquer. This seems highly unlikely, but never mind that. We know that we are better than the abuse of executive authority that we witnessed in Lafayette Square. We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution. At the same time, we must remember Lincoln's better angels and listen to them as we work to unite. Yes, the same Abraham Lincoln who pretty much declared martial law during the Civil War, suspended habeas corpus, had thousands of people arrested for political reasons, and attempted to arrest Justice Roger Taney of the Supreme Court. That Abraham Lincoln. Lafayette Park was cleared by the U.S. Park Police, which was falsely accused of using tear gas to disperse protesters. The Park Police said Tuesday that they cleared because of some of the protesters began throwing projectiles, including bricks, frozen water bottles, and caustic liquids. The U.S. Park Police, is that the military now? Mad Dog? Mattis, whom Trump appointed at the start of his administration, resigned in December 2018 over diplomatic disagreements with the president. He implied that Trump was not doing enough to support multilateral institutions, specifically continuing to wreck Syria on behalf of, wait for it, Al-Qaeda. Yes, that's who President Obama allied the United States with, Al-Qaeda. More on the coup, the third coup attempt. This one, a military one, again from Breitbart. Yet another former military leader, retired Marine Corps General John Allen, is criticizing Trump's response to the protests following George Floyd's death. A day after Defense Secretary Mark Esper shot down Trump's idea of using active duty troops to quell protests across the United States, retired four-star General John Allen joined the chorus of former military leaders going after the president. And Republican Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski said Esper's remarks were overdue and she didn't know if she would support Trump in November. You remember that Machiavelli was talking about one of the symptoms of elite decadence was a determination, to have an oligarchical system where it is, same families running things. Well, Lisa Murkowski never would have gone higher than the level of mayor if not for who her father was. She eventually was elected very suspiciously, I might add, on a sympathy vote. Although Esper's declaration was followed by the Pentagon reversing course on pulling part of the 82nd Airborne Division off standby outside Washington, the rising criticism underscored an extraordinary clash between the U.S. military and its commander-in-chief. Now, let's see, what other generals do we have here? Oh, he said, Trump going to this historic church and brandishing a Bible, quote, may well signal the beginning of the end of the American experiment, unquote. It was Erich von Kuhnau-Ledin who wrote how much he hated this term, the American experiment. Well, what if the experiment doesn't turn out right? Does that mean the United States is going to be called off The United States of America, like any other country, isn't an experiment. It is a country full of people, history, traditions, community. It's not a bunch of petri dishes. General Allen, president of the liberal-leaning Brookings Institution, contrasted the routing of the protesters in Lafayette Park with remarks by Floyd's brother, Terrence Floyd, who denounced looting that he said tarnishes his brother's memory. You see that the family of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, this has become an industry for them. He died in 1968, but the industry is still going strong 52 years later. Of course, there are two branches of the family, and they're constantly suing each other. Do you know that speeches that Martin Luther King made in public have been copyrighted, and so that news organizations have to pay to use them? Can you imagine that? Public statements cannot be copyrighted. But I guess there's a special law for the family of the sainted Dr. King. Okay, so I believe we have more military men here who are suggesting seditious insurrection, seditious conspiracy. Oh, hang on just one second. Hang on. I'm almost there. It's not in the AP story. It is in the Washington Examiner story. We have another former senior official carrying on about Michael Hayden, very sinister man. Former CIA Director Michael Hayden called on Defense Secretary Mark Esper to resign after he accompanied President Trump to pose for photos in front of a vandalized church across from the White House. Esper walked with Trump across Lafayette Square on Monday after peaceful protesters had been forcibly cleared from the area. The same peaceful protesters who set the church on fire, which drew widespread condemnation. 2 days ago, I thought maybe he should resign. Hayden told CNN in an interview Wednesday. When asked whether he still thought that, Hayden said, "Yes, I do." Well, how about that? And who is Michael Hayden? Well, I'm going to be talking about Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, and he describes that beginning about 20 years ago, the intelligence community in the United States was taken over lock, stock, and barrel by the military. And Hayden was in the forefront. He's a retired USAF four-star general, former director of the National Security Agency, principal deputy director of national intelligence, and director of the Central Intelligence Agency. In other words, Mr. Deep State. The Constitution. How about spying on American citizens without warrant, without probable cause? How about that? Well, General Hayden, he was the leader of that. Yes, it all began under his watch. And let's see. In May 2006, USA Today reported that under Hayden's leadership, the NSA created a domestic telephone call database. During his nomination hearings, Hayden defended his actions to Senator Russ Feingold and others, stating that he had relied upon legal advice from the White House that building the database was supported by Article 2 of the Constitution, executive branch powers, in which the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed, overriding legislative branch statutes forbidding warrantless surveillance of domestic calls, which included the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Previously, this action would have required a warrant from a FISA court. The stated purpose of the database was to eavesdrop on international communications between persons within the U.S. and individuals and groups overseas in order to locate terrorists. Let's see. In 2006, Hayden participated in a news conference. A YouTube video was posted of him telling reporters at a press conference that probable cause is not required for all searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment, claiming instead that the standard is whether the search or seizure is reasonable. Probable cause is required for all warrants, whether or not the search or seizure is deemed to be unreasonable. Hayden referred to people who believe that torture of CIA detainees has never yielded useful intelligence as interrogation deniers. You know, kind of like Holocaust deniers. In September 2013, Hayden stressed the indisputable legality of what the NSA is doing and called Edward Snowden a troubled young man and morally arrogant to a tremendous degree. How about that? This is the champion of the Constitution who believes that the United States government should be able to spy on anyone, everywhere, for any pretext or none. So we have three top generals, and we see that the deep state, as was obvious right from the very beginning, will not tolerate Trump. I don't know why Jim Mattis became defense secretary. Presumably he wanted to spruce up his resume. Oh, let's see. This is from ABC News. While rare and perhaps unprecedented for former military leaders to do publicly and to do so publicly and forcefully, this sounds like I can't read properly, but the difficulty is that so many of these problems, so many of these stories now are just chock full of grammatical and syntactical errors, words which are repeated, words which are unnecessary, words which have been eliminated. So bear with me here. Trump's flaunting of the Insurrection Act, quote, was sufficiently disturbing that General Mattis chose to break his silence, unquote, says Christine Wormuth, who served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense from 2012 to 2014. She said that the essay was the inevitable conclusion of the increasingly this story is appallingly written. The increasing politicization, not increasingly as ABC has it, of the military under the Trump administration. It was meant to give a clear reminder to the military that they swore an oath to the Constitution. It sends a strong message to members of the military to remind it of what's important and to do what they think is right. What the military thought was right after 2001 was to kidnap people from all over the world and send them to places like Pakistan and Syria for them to be tortured, often to death. Oh, and they contracted out torture to other countries. That's what the U.S. military thought was right. And Ace of Spades has been on fire recently. He writes, hey, this would be a great time to hear from the corporate-funded GOP fake conservative media about how all of the deplorable conservative scaremongering over the alleged radicalism of Obama was just hysterics due to racism. Quote, a former Obama administration intelligence official, are you noticing a pattern here? Who worked in both the Departments of State and Defense, has guaranteed bail for a human rights lawyer accused of firebombing a police vehicle in New York City. The former official, Salma Rizvi, who was a native of Pakistan, told the judge the alleged firebomber is her best friend. Rizvi, now an attorney at the DC-based law firm Ropes and Gray, helped secure the release of fellow lawyer Uruj Rahman by agreeing to be a suretor for her bail. That means Rizvi is liable for the full cost of the $250,000 bail if Rahman fails to obey the court's order. Rahman was released to home confinement over the objections of government attorneys after her arrest on Saturday for throwing a lit Molotov cocktail through the window of an NYPD vehicle. Evidence presented by prosecutors included images of Rahman holding a Molotov cocktail in the passenger seat of a van that was later found to be full of the necessary materials for making the explosive devices. U.S. District Judge Margot Brody acknowledged the strong evidence against Rahman, but was also accused of distributing the incendiary devices to other rioters, but agreed to grant her bail due to the willingness of family and friends to sign on as suretors. Ace says, here's a story about two left-wing, fully credentialed lawyers, proud avatars of the professional managerial class who are domestic terrorists. Quick, Rich Lowry. Quick, Dan McLaughlin. Tell me which of our inviolable civic norms we're supposed to be maintaining when Obama officials are bailing out their best friend Antifa terrorist friends. You guys assured us that norms were the most important thing. So start lecturing us about norms, assholes. Go back to vouching for the moderation and integrity of your media government complex pals. Hey, Rich Lowry, the recent convert to nationalism, and surely for reasons of deep moral and intellectual conviction, not to adapt his grift to changing times. Got to keep those norms intact, got to preserve the system for people like Obama's Antifa crew. Oh, now I've been saying since this live stream began, and before that for quite some time on the other live stream I was on, that there is a concerted movement to abolish the police, to in effect to put Black people above the law. And you may have thought me guilty of hyperbole, but I'm afraid I have the last laugh here, not that I am laughing. This is from The Guardian. Activists say the way to stop police brutality and killings is to cut law enforcement budgets and reinvest in services. Some lawmakers now agree. The movement to defund the police is gaining significant support across America, including from elected leaders as protests over the killing of George Floyd sweep the nation. For years, activists have pushed U.S. cities and states to cut law enforcement budgets amid a dramatic rise in spending on police and prisons, while funding for vital social services has shrunk or disappeared altogether. You're lying. The idea that spending on social services has shrunk or disappeared. Hilarious. Government officials have long dismissed this idea as a leftist fantasy, but the recent unrest and massive budget shortfalls from the COVID-19 crisis appear to have inspired more mainstream recognition of the central arguments behind defunding. Julia Salazar, a New York State senator and Democratic socialist, told The Guardian to see legislators who aren't even necessarily on the left supporting at least a significant decrease in New York Police Department funding is really very encouraging. It feels a little bit surreal. Okay, and this is actually happening. Here's a story from Deadline about Los Angeles. As he began to speak about reforming the Los Angeles Police Department during his Wednesday evening press conference, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti called this an urgent moment for the city, an inflection point. There have been protesters, lots of protesters outside his home yelling and screaming at him. That might have had something to do with his decision. He said he is committed to making this moment not just a moment. Garcetti said he would be making commitments to creating racial equality. It is time to move our rhetoric towards action to end racism in our city. Of course, racism can never be ended. Even a totalitarian state would be unable to end racism, which, as Peter Sippel pointed out, should always be spelled within inverted commas. But I suppose we're going to get the full apparatus of totalitarianism or something close to it in a vain attempt to end racism. He said the city must move beyond police reforms of the past. Quote, prejudice can never be part of police work. It takes bravery to save lives, too, unquote. Well, prejudice is always going to be part of police work because certain people are more likely to do certain things. It's that simple. Everyone knows it. We will not be increasing our police budget. He said, well, yes. The mayor proceeded to announce $250 million in cuts to the proposed budget and to reallocate those dollars to communities of color so we can invest in jobs, in education and healing. What kinds of jobs? Community activist jobs? LA Police Commission President Eileen Decker then announced that $100 to $150 million of those cuts would come from the police department budget. Let's see, LA City Council President Nuri Martinez, and you get the impression that Los Angeles is not run by white people anymore. And again, this is a situation where it's the progressives and the people of color are in charge of these places, and yet everything is falling apart. But of course, the solution must be more progressivism. So LA City Council President Muri Martinez tweeted, "Today we introduced a motion to cut funding to the LAPD as we reset our priorities in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter call that we all support to end racism. This is just one small step. We cannot talk about change. We have to be about change." We have activity in other cities as well, and let's look at some of them. In New York, the mayor, Bill de Blasio, is pushing to leave the NYPD's nearly $6 billion budget intact while slashing education and youth programs and cutting other agencies by as much as 80%. Not going to happen. In Philadelphia, the mayor has proposed spending $977 million on police and prisons, which is 20% of the general fund. And this includes a $14 million increase for police. Again, everyone's going to be following Los Angeles because they're all looking to make cuts. And apparently everyone all hates the police now. So they're going to get it. I just want to clarify my own view on police brutality. With the collapse of society, the atomization, the communities that police used to travel in, they don't exist anymore. Police used to walk the beat, used to walk the streets. They used to know their communities. They don't do so anymore for various reasons. Changes in police philosophy. Also, I suppose it would be fairly dangerous in many cases. Instead, they travel in their cruisers and they look out their window, looking at us all as if we are potential criminals. The police have been thoroughly militarized. They look like soldiers now, which is not a good thing. And before Ferguson and Baltimore, there was a considerable movement on the right, actually, to do something about police brutality. But then, if it comes down to chaos versus whatever, then whatever is going to be adopted. It's not impossible that the right could get in on this, because I know that there's a lot of people on the right who have had unpleasant experiences with the police. It was fairly common for the police to burst into people's homes, shooting everything up based on tips given by prison snitches. And these were almost always made up. And, we were warned against self-defense. The police don't seem to like the idea of self-defense. Of course, we are all our own best defenders, and ultimately it comes down to us. In some ways, I don't blame the police for the deterioration of their status and the increase in the forcefulness of their measures. But I think that it really would behoove us to try to improve the situation as best as one can, because as I pointed out, if we're looking at people being shot by police, it's not just that many more whites are shot to death by police than blacks. Even proportionally, whites are shot to death more than blacks. And one of the reasons for this is that police are increasingly wary of any kind of violent confrontation with black people. Because even when you are acquitted, like Darren Wilson, well, he got fired. And it means increasingly you're risking the end of your professional career and the destruction of your personal life. So, moving on. This is so funny. This is from Summit News, Paul Joseph Watson. 2 videos out of the US and the UK both show Good Samaritans trying to clean off Black Lives Matter graffiti from buildings and monuments being harassed and called racist. The first clip shows 3 young women scrubbing BLM graffiti off the side of the Lafayette building in Washington, D.C. "Why are you guys removing Black Lives Matter graffiti?" asked the woman filming the video, whose name is likely to be Karen. One of the girls then explains how they are removing the graffiti, prompting Karen to ask, "But why do you want that to come off?" Another of the girls explains that it's vandalism, to which Karen responds, "So you don't care about Black lives then?" The confrontation ends with Karen lecturing the girls, "Not a great way to use your white privilege, ladies. That's disgusting." Another video shows a group of young men trying to remove anti-police graffiti from a war memorial in London. "Couldn't even wait a day, not one day, because of their precious memorial," snarks the girl filming the clip. They are then berated by another woman for the sin of attempting to clean the area by picking up discarded Black Lives Matter signs. The woman recording the video then says, "I'm going to get their faces in. Everybody say cheese," in an apparent effort to dox the young men. The men responded by laughing at the women. The inner city, no-go areas, they're very depressing places for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons is the graffiti everywhere. And I don't know, maybe Black Lives Matter should head up to Georgetown in Washington. It's kind of difficult to get there because, very deliberately, the Metro Transit, the subway, the light rail, it does not go through Georgetown by design. But, why aren't they sharing in this bounty? If graffiti is a great thing, and if Black Lives Matter must be sprayed on every building, then why should Georgetown be exempt? Maybe they should do it themselves. And yeah, cleaning up the buildings in your city, you're a racist. No. We see the particularly mimetic quality of women here. If Trump moves quickly, if the forces shift, then you'll see a lot of these Karens go over to the other side. But women they tend to seek consensus, and they are not very forgiving towards people, particularly other women who announce they are not going to be part of the consensus. John Daniel Davidson writes in The Federalist, amid the scenes circulating on social media this week of protesters and rioters and burned out storefronts and police barricades, two stand out as harbingers of what this all means for the future of mainstream American society. The first was a video clip of a small group of white people kneeling down before a group of Black people. A white man at the head of the kneeling group was praying, his voice shaking with emotion, quote, "Father, we ask for forgiveness from our Black brothers and sisters for years and years of racism, of systematic racism," unquote. The second was a clip of a large gathering in the affluent D.C. suburb of Bethesda, Maryland. Nearly 1,000 protesters, most of them white, their hands raised as if in prayer, engaged in a kind of collective woke sermon, repeating after a man on a microphone, quote, "I will use my voice in the most uplifting way possible and do everything in my power to educate my community. I will love my Black neighbors the same way as my white ones." Ian Miles Chung, I don't know how it's pronounced. He tweeted, "Protesters in Bethesda attended a woke sermon to cry about their white guilt. Note that not a single one of them is social distancing. 2 weeks ago, the media would have called them terrorists." I'm beginning to suspect that sometime this year, the mayors and the other leaders are social distancing. What are you talking about? You remember when you ordered us to say 6 feet or 2 meters away from each other? No, I never said any such thing. What are you talking about? This is typical right-wing disinformation. The model at work here is the Chinese Cultural Revolution, with its mass struggle sessions in which anyone deemed insufficiently sympathetic to the proletariat or thought to have an excessively bourgeois lifestyle was subjected to public humiliations, paraded through the streets, assaulted, denounced, and put on display as objects of scorn. Often these struggle sessions ended in false confessions and pleas for mercy. Obviously, no one in America is being paraded through the streets against their will. Well, I'll tell you that this sort of thing goes on in American colleges and American workplaces all the time. And if you don't take part in the struggle sessions, you will be failed, or you will be suspended, or you will be expelled from school. If you don't take part in them in the workplace, I don't know, you're not going to get any more promotions there, and maybe you certainly will find yourself getting negative performance evaluations from your superiors, and so they all grovel We're going to be talking about the sports world and its part in this very quickly. But the author at the Federalist mentions the sad case of the Sacramento Kings play-by-play announcer Grant Napier and the personal struggle session that he engaged in. There's another story from Summit News. Teen Vogue tells readers Antifa aspires toward creating a better world. As violence, looting, and rioting continue to plague almost every American city, virtue signaling leftist publication Teen Vogue told its readers that the ringleaders of the carnage, Antifa, really just wants to create a better world. Quote, Antifa grows out of a larger revolutionary politics that aspires toward creating a better world, but the primary motivation is to stop racists from organizing, unquote. A tweet from the publication reads, well, that's cleared up then. But hang on, why are legitimate protesters confronting and opposing Antifa chicken necks? Here's a tweet from Paul Joseph Watson. Black protester tackles Antifa rioter trying to loot store. But wait, blue check marks on here told me Twitter are literally the same as World War II troops who stormed the beaches of Normandy. If you ever run into these people, just remind them that Stalin was Hitler's ally, that they had an actual pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that Stalin invaded Poland two weeks after Hitler. He then rolled over the Baltic countries and invaded Finland. And the Antifa in the United States, who are overwhelmingly communists, took the position that it would be wicked for the United States to enter the war against the Nazis. And they kept this up for almost 2 years. And then when Hitler turned on Stalin, they turned on a dime. Teen Vogue. Do not let your children read Teen Vogue. That is the quite possibly the most toxic publication for young people in America. One of the most dangerous magazines in America. This is from the Daily Mail. Looters in New York City were dropped off in luxury cars with power tools and suitcases and used stolen U-Hauls for coordinated attacks as officials across the U.S. blamed organized crime for the chaos. NYPD are said to be looking into numerous reports that the rioters were organized. They are now checking license plates numbers of cars that dropped groups off. Cars would drive up, let off the looters, unload power tools, one witness said. Another said this is organized crime happening really, really well. Local leaders and business owners in Washington, California, and Chicago have also suggested the looters were part of organized crime rings. And in more Antifa news, this is from the Daily Wire. Acting Department of Homeland Security Chad Wolf, that's actually his name, told Fox News on Wednesday night that federal law enforcement officials have opened cases up against leaders of Antifa and other organizations who are believed to be behind violent riots that are plaguing the nation's inner cities. When asked by Fox News host Brett Baier who was behind the violent protests, Wolf answered, quote, I think overall, what we have seen as far as taking place, sort of boots on the ground in these metropolitan areas, are the groups like Antifa or anarchists in general. And those are the types of people that we see. That's the intel that we're getting back, primarily moving these violent protests and these organizations in a certain way. It usually happens after nightfall. So during the day, we usually see the nonviolent protests occurring. And then when it gets to the night, we see the more violent protests starting to happen, criminals starting to take place, organized, loosely organized during the day to achieve a specific goal. So we will continue to look at, we are partnering. We have a number of investigators at the department who are working with the Department of Justice and the FBI. We know that they have opened up a number of cases, specifically targeting some of the leaders of Antifa and other organizations that are involved. Yes, a great many media organizations, I would guess. And we know that Keith Ellison, who's the Attorney General of Minnesota, he tweeted out holding a book called Antifa. I believe this was in January or December of last year, saying that this was the book that scared Trump to death. He later deleted the tweet. One might thought that this would lead to him having to recuse himself from any George Floyd trials, but apparently not. Ellison's son, who's on Minneapolis City Council, he's not so coy as his father, and he came out publicly in support of Antifa the other day. Let's go back to the chat. Okay. Scroll up here. No one has a plan, says Claire Kahn. Well, because we can't see the plan doesn't mean that no one has a plan. I'm tired of offending Dems, though I want a white Wakanda. Well, if you seek our monument, look around you, as the saying goes, from the man who designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London. We need a Savonarola, says Chogokin666. Yeah, look what happened to him. Look what happened to him. Okay. Yeah, I'll get to the medical report on George Floyd shortly. Small hats are revolutionary. So what is new, KMG? I don't understand that, but Yehuda says leftists don't need to make conservatives live up to their own rules. Conservative Inc. will make sure of that. Yes, that's exactly the case. That one of the reasons why Conservatism Inc. was so appalled and terrified by Trump is that he made it clear he was not a conservative and that he had no interest in their rules. He was actually interested in winning. He said that again and again. Jules Roy says Mayor Lightfoot transcends traditional narratives about beauty. Indeed, she does. Don from Beyond. Oh, I'm not going to go into that. Jim Bowden, neoliberal capitalism equals usury. Well, usury is the basis of capitalism. Sorry, there's no getting away from it. Jeffrey Neal says, our three largest cities already female Democrat liberal mayors. Arizona is no longer a refuge for conservatives. I saw that during a Trump rally in 2016, where the Trump supporters were just being wailed on by anti-Trumpers, Antifa presumably, and the Phoenix police. They just sat and watched. And I said at the time, did they miss the lesson about skull busting at cop school? Let's say Audible. Okay, someone's talking about Audible. John Miller says, true, migration and immigration is rapidly changing. This state, I hate McSally so much. She is probably the most inept campaigner I've ever seen. Yes, she lost a perfectly winnable seat and then managed to get into the Senate anyway. She's also clearly a closeted lesbian, but I suppose, Conservatism Inc. doesn't care about that. Oh, okay. What else do we have here? John Miller says Jim Mattis basically stabbed Trump in the back. He's trying to find his way back to D.C. under a potential Biden administration. It could be. It could be. I think that what went on with Jim Mattis is that I'm the general. Trump is in awe of men like me. After all, I'm Mad Dog Mattis. And so, this nonsense about the United States not doing forever wars anymore. Yeah, I'll have Trump eating out of my hand on that. Well, that didn't happen. And he got sacked. Walrus Libertarian says, I think the whole throwing the police under the bus plan is going to backfire. Another populist win coming up. William Hicks, didn't General MacArthur on FDR's order clear out the veterans from Hooverville and Washington, D.C. circa 1993 to 1934? Yes, the bonus marchers. And they had their hash settled by General MacArthur. And he suffered from this popularly for the rest of his life. But of course, it was FDR's order. The great progressive Saint Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Bonus army. The kneeling. Oh, the kneeling is completely out of control. We have police kneeling everywhere. We have police dancing with the protesters. Now, Paul Joseph Watson said that American police are almost as cringe as British police, which is quite saying something. Yes, and it is quite saying something. Okay, John Miller says, okay, they're talking about the soft right here, Charlie Kirk and the like. Dan Ellison says, language is natural in God's creation. PC destroys the beauty God creates like an oil spill destroys a shoreline. That's a nice simile. Lecomte de Barrea says, actually, today I realized Justin Trudeau is a genius. I don't really understand the reference there. Chogokin666 said Nixon won big on the law and order front. The silent majority is opposed to the vocal hippies and Mau Mau's. I was talking about that yesterday. There's been a big change in America since the 1960s. In the 1960s, America was still overwhelmingly conservative. I mean, at a personal level, at a communal level. All of the nonsense that we got from the left, it was restricted to college students for the most part. And I'll tell you a big difference. Tom Wolfe writes about this, that we all know about Kent State, where 4 students were shot to death by the National Guard. And then shortly thereafter at Jackson State, which is a black college, 2 people were shot to death. And the American left, the revolutionaries, the Marxists, they were expecting an insurrection. And when school reconvened in September, there was no revolution, because the kids had figured out that playing at revolution can get you killed. But the National Guard is not shooting people today. I mean, it's not doing it. And I would say one of the reasons for this is that America is simply a much more feminized country today than it was in the 1960s. To the extent that we don't want to call rioters because it would hurt people's feelings. That protesters saying, oh, don't lump me in with those rioters. You're in the same group of people, and you go out onto the streets knowing that a certain number of you are going to start attacking buildings, setting things on fire, and yet you continue to go out to the streets and associate with these people. A fellow whose name is Oriental Character says Trump was partially elected on a mandate to basically mess up the deep state. So in a sense, I guess it's not so off from his being an insurgent president. I think so. Metal Mike says Trump may just be the last patriotic president. Are there any impressive Republicans who can win in 2024? Well, there's Senator Hawley from Missouri, who impresses. Okay, so let's see. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is reminding everyone troops serve the people, not the government. This is getting interesting very fast, says Manfred von Thistlebaum. Oh, the troops serve the people. Do they? Because I think if they'd held a poll on, the day before D-Day, June 6, 1944, hey, we're going to charge the beaches tomorrow, and a whole bunch of you, many, many thousands of you are going to be dead before you hit the beach. You're going to be torn to pieces by German heavy machine gun fire, and you'll die on the spot if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you'll die in agony some hours or days later. So what do you say, boys? You want to do this or not? I suspect there'd be a very strong vote against doing it. I mean, people generally don't want to be the first to die. I mean, we know this going back as far as the Iliad, when it was predicted that the first person on the beach would die. And so he did. And so there was a reluctance by the Greeks to actually hit the beach. Okay, let's, I want them to abolish the police in Minneapolis, says Manfred von Thistlebaum. Well, I mean, we may see just a panicked fleeing to the suburbs and to the exurbs now, because we know what life is like in those parts of America where the police tend to tread lightly. It is, it's indescribable in its horror, Adam says the backlash is seething just under the surface. The cycle of revolution and counter-revolution will escalate. It can only end in guillotines, but whose side will be dropping the knife? Well, yes, That's a good point. Brandon Smith says wealth gap has made a large number of people much more desperate than COVID. Yes, and I think this plays a part in the rioting, particularly the white people who are involved in the riots, that they see their future. They saw their future as desperate before COVID, and with COVID, they see their future. Well, they don't have a future. They don't have a future. So, what do they have to lose? Okay, moving on. Okay, we did that. Oh, Tim Wise. I'm sure quite a few of my viewers are familiar with this despicable man. Again, from Summit News. CNN gave airtime to an anti-racist activist who suggested that white children should not be allowed to have a, quote, innocent, unquote, childhood, but rather be made to feel guilty about their white privilege at an early age. CNN host Poppy Harlow cited a letter sent to her from a school directing white parents how to teach their kids about their white privilege and asked Tim Wise, when should parents do this with their kids and how? Wise responded that it should be at as young an age as possible and that white kids need to be repeatedly told they are overprivileged in order to sufficiently indoctrinate them. Quote, I think the important thing for white parents to keep in the front of our mind is that if black children in this country are not allowed innocence in childhood without fear of being killed by police or marginalized in some way, then our children don't deserve innocence. Our children, Tim? If Tamir Rice can be shot dead in a public park playing with a toy gun, something white children do all over this country every day without the same fear of being shot, if Tamir Rice can be killed, then white children need to be told, at least at the same age, that if they can't be innocent, we don't get to be innocent. If we could keep that in front of our minds, then perhaps we'd be able to hear what black and brown folks are telling us every day and have been for many years. Yeah, I mentioned this before. I suppose if there were a modern-day equivalent of a Jewish Sanhedrin, they would tell Tim Wise to shut the hell up. Because Tim Wise makes his living by declaring war on white people, but he's white, right? Oh, no, that's not how he sees it. White privilege, white privilege, white privileged. Who in the media, in finance, academia, etc., who are the most privileged? Well, Tim Wise does not want a discussion of that. Oh, you've heard me carry on about the Criterion Collection and how much I love it and how, I wish I had enough money to buy more Criterion Collection Blu-rays. And they disappointed me today. I suppose it was coming, but it's still sad. This is a message that they sent out to their subscribers and put on their Twitter feed. Black Lives Matter. The anguish and fury unleashed all across the country are rooted in centuries of dehumanization and death. This pattern must stop. We support the protesters who have taken to the streets to demand justice, and we share their hopes. We are committed to fighting systemic racism. There was one part in particular. Oh, yes, this has been a powerfully emotional time. The disproportionate toll that COVID-19 has taken on communities of color. Oh, boo, groan, hiss. The murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Tony McDade, and the casually lethal racism of the Central Park dog walker who called the cops on birdwatcher Christian Cooper have once again thrown into sharp focus, blah, blah, blah. Casually lethal racism. Okay, so you had two people in Central Park, and there was a white woman and a black man. And she had a dog, and the dog was not on the leash, so he started remonstrating with her that the dog should be on the leash, and that he said that he brought up these dog treats that he carries around with him with the suggestion that he was going to kidnap her dog, and then he told her, you do what you're going to do, I'll do what I'm going to do. Now, she saw this as a threat. Perhaps she overreacted. But to speak of casually lethal racism in this occasion is simply fatuous. This is from the Daily Star in London. George Floyd had coronavirus and died after cardiac arrest, according to the Hennepin County Autopsy report. Is this going to go down in the books as a COVID-19 death? That would be quite ironic, don't you think? An autopsy report has been released confirming George Floyd died from cardiac arrest, which was complicated by law enforcement subdural. It says he died of cardiopulmonary arrest complicated by law enforcement subdual, which the cardiac arrest made the cops' restraint more lethal. What? His heart stopped? No, that's complicated, or perhaps poorly written. The final diagnosis says a 46-year-old man who became unresponsive while being restrained by law enforcement officers. He received emergency medical care in the field and subsequently in the Hennepin Healthcare Emergency Department, but could not be resuscitated. This comes after an autopsy ordered by, I'm not going to talk about the autopsy ordered by the family. So, someone on Twitter, Fulworth Bernard Skipwith, says George Floyd's toxicology screen is impressive. Fentanyl, number one, I guess this is in terms of how much, norfentanyl, and then 4-ANPP, I don't know what that means, and then methamphetamine, I do know what that means, and then THC, I know what that means. It means he was smoking marijuana. 6 cotinine positive and 7 caffeine positive. Cotinine, let's look that up. Cotinine is, he was smoking. It's an alkaloid found in tobacco and also the predominant metabolite of nicotine. Okay, yeah, but none of this is going to stop the narrative that George Floyd was a holy man. Father Jim Martin has already compared him explicitly to Jesus Christ. Oh, okay, Frank Burton sent this along to me. Andy Slavitt, who was an ex-Obama healthcare head, he describes himself as a helper. Oh, isn't that sweet? He wrote, public health commissioners should issue guidance that all officers on site set the tone, not only by taking a knee with protesters, but by wearing a face mask, socially distancing, and allowing the crowd to socially distance. Frank Burton comments, public health officials will now instruct police officers to take a knee. The public health dictatorship trashed the economy and atomized society. Now it will regulate race relations and demand ritual gestures of submission from whites. Yes, we've already been told that white people have a virus. Now, this is a metaphorical virus, but the so-called public health community, I don't know whether they know that it is that is metaphorical. Hand sanitizer. Yeah, go out in the streets, treat by gel, but just make sure that you use that hand sanitizer. I don't know. What if you shoot someone and that person's blood spatters you? I mean, does Andy Slavitt have any recommendations, for this? The public health dictatorship is completely, it is a dictatorship, and these public health officials are completely out of hand. They need to be brought down a peg or 2 or 3. Molly Hemingway writes in The Federalist, following days of violent riots and looting in cities across the country, Washington, D.C. announced a 7 p.m. curfew on Monday night. About the same time, President Donald Trump addressed the nation from the Rose Garden. Afterward, he walked through Lafayette Park to St. John's Episcopal Church, which rioters had set on fire the night before. Standing before the church sign, which reads, "All are welcome," President Trump, who previously said he'd be paying his respects to a very special place, held up a Bible. The speech announcing the country would return to rule of law and protection of civil liberties, the walk through a park that the night before had been given over to rioters, and the visit to the vandalized historic church where every president has worshipped since James Madison, were reassuring to many in the country. For the media, however, these actions were further proof that Orange Man bad is literally the worst, restoring rule of law is criminal, and standing in front of a church holding a Bible is an assault on the American conscience. They focused on how the park police, no, not the military, despite the fact that media says this all the time, had cleared the area ahead of the citywide curfew declared by D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Facts were no barrier to their narrative. They spun a tale of violent, jackbooted cops running rampant through the streets over innocent, docile protesters using tear gas to clear the area. It turns out that none of that was true. Every single major media outlet falsely reported that park police were unprovoked when they used tear gas to clear the area. If any of that were true, it might mark the first time in history that cops without gas masks launched tear gas in an area that the President of the United States easily walked through minutes later. After thousands of false tweets, print stories, and broadcast stories to the contrary, local journalist Neil Augenstein of WTOP reported that a park police source said tear gas was never used. Instead, smoke canisters were deployed, which don't have an uncomfortable irritant in there. Further, the source said that the cop was dispersed because of projectiles being thrown by the peaceful protesters at the park police, and because peaceful protesters had climbed up on top of a structure in Lafayette Park that had been burned the prior night. Sergeant Eduardo Delgato, the public information officer for the park police, confirmed the agency did not use tear gas. Reuters published a video claiming that U.S. Park Police used tear gas. The video did not show any such thing. A Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter tweeted out an NPR piece headline, "Park Police Tear Gas Peaceful Protesters to Clear Way for Trump Church Photo Op." Now, I was talking about the elites and the use of power and the futility of opposing this with facts and logic. Now, it is useful for us to know the truth, but the other side does not care. It simply does not care. And pointing out the truth to these people is not going to make any difference. It is simply a waste of your time, complete waste of your time. So, that being the case, don't do it. Don't do it. Joe Hill, the famous union leader with the International Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies, he was executed. When he was on the scaffold, he said, "Don't mourn, organize." And that is very good advice. Again, I'm talking about Tim Weiner's book on the CIA tomorrow. And he describes when in 2006, when President Bush fired Porter Goss from being director of the CIA, he writes, "The next day, Goss got on a plane and delivered the commencement address at Tiffin University. Quote, if this were a graduating class of CIA case officers, my advice would be short and to the point. Admit nothing, deny everything, and make counter accusations." Again, admit nothing, deny everything, and make counter accusations. This is how the left operates. And if we want to survive, we're going to have to do the same thing. Drew Brees, who's in the news the last few days, is one of the greatest quarterbacks in American history. He's a Super Bowl champion, Super Bowl MVP, 13-time Pro Bowler, twice NFL Offensive Player of the Year, Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year. He holds all of these records, all-time records for completions, yardage, etc., etc., etc. And he's had a very long career. Let's see. He is 41 years old. And I think this is relevant to what's coming up here. Let's see. FS1's Shannon Sharp says Drew Brees should retire now after anthem protest comments. Fox Sports broadcaster Sharp said that New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees should retire over his recent comments in which he said that he found kneeling during the anthem to be a sign of disrespect. Can you imagine that? Shocking. On Wednesday, Brees insisted that even today he does not support Colin Kaepernick's protest during the national anthem, even though he feels that Kaepernick has a right to his opinion. Brees just feels that refusing to stand for the anthem is just the wrong time and place to protest. The comment set off a long list of athletes and broadcasters, including Sharp. Even after Brees apologized for insensitive comments about the anthem protest, Sharp went off on the player and exclaimed, "I'll never respect him," because of his comments about Kaepernick's anti-American protests. Quote, "He issued an apology, Skip, but it's meaningless because the guys know he spoke his heart the very first time around." That's a good point there. That's a good point. Because make an apology, you're going to have to keep making apologies because people are going to say, if he didn't believe it, why did he say? You know that so many of the people who make these apologies say, "That's not me," or "That's not who I am." People make a habit of, stepping out, to make declarations without being asked to, things they simply don't believe. I don't know what Drew's going to do, but he'll probably just go ahead and retire now. He will never be the same. The commentator and NFL Hall of Famer continued, "Take it from a guy that has been a leader in the locker room for a number of years. What he said, they will never look at him the same because he spoke his heart. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. He was defiant. I will never respect the man," Sharp said. Well, I was waiting to see whether the New Orleans Saints were going to suspend him or fine him $1 million or trade him or bench him, or whether the NFL, the National Felons League, was going to step in and do the same. Because essentially, Drew Brees stood up for American patriotism, and the black players of the NFL said, "We are not having it." And guess who won that battle? Well, we know. I mean, as soon as he made this statement and it was reported, I knew what was going to happen. "I stand with the black community," says Drew Brees. Well, yeah, you can say that. Oh, no, seriously? He posted something to Instagram, his apology, and it has one of the hands, one of the arms is white, and one of them is black. Very cringeworthy. His career is finished, and I guess, for the next 5, 10 years, 20 years, we're going to be debating, should Drew Brees be elected to the Hall of Fame after the racist, murderous comments that he made? Seriously, wait for it. It's coming. This is from Fox News. Sacramento Kings play-by-play announcer Grant Napier, who called games for the NBA team since 1988, was sacked Tuesday following comments he made regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. He said, "I want to thank the fans for their overwhelming love and support. I will always remain a part of Kings Nation in my heart." On Sunday evening, Napier responded on Twitter to former Kings star DeMarcus Cousins, who asked him to comment on the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the May 25th death of George Floyd. "Hey, how are you? Thought you forgot about me. Haven't heard from you in years. All lives matter. Every single one." He was asked, "What's your take on BLM?" Well, everyone has to support BLM, especially in this sporting community, because if you don't, you'll be punished. Oh, we have another apologizer here. Head coach Vic Fangio of the Denver Broncos said that he didn't really think the NFL had much of a racism problem. And he formally apologized after reflecting on my comments yesterday and listening to the players this morning. "I realized what I said regarding racism and discrimination in the NFL was wrong. While I have never personally experienced those terrible things firsthand during my 33 years in the NFL, I understand that many players, coaches, and staff have different perspectives. I should have been more clear, and I'm sorry." And it goes on. I just, how much money do these people have, right? How much humiliation are people willing to withstand? you know. But this is what it's coming to. You know that attendance in the NFL, even before COVID-19, it plunged. For decades, you could not get a seat. Oh, like for the Washington Redskins, there have been like divorce battles fought over seasons tickets for the Washington Redskins. The Redskins gave what seasons tickets to some guy who very cleverly figured out how they could shove more seats in their stadium. And we've all seen the pictures of quarter empty, half empty stadia. The ratings or TV ratings are down, down, down. And one of the reasons that they're down is because of Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling. It's a gesture of defiance against the American flag. The white people kneeling in front of black people is a gesture of submission. That's different. It's been repurposed. But the NFL has decided that it's on the side of the anti-patriots, that it's on the side of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And, Joe Sixpack and his wife, who they have seasons tickets, they are spending a lot of their disposable income on this. Because, they got to buy all the merch, and it's expensive to go to football games. Those beers and hot dogs they're not cheap. And they're not going to put up with it. They're simply not going to put up with it. I mean, it's very easy to bully people, to bully weak politicians. But the thing is that, Joe Sixpack and his wife, they don't have to watch football. They don't have to pay through the nose to have seasons tickets. They don't have to watch on TV. There's plenty of other things on TV. They don't have to buy the hats and the jerseys. And I don't know. I was thinking, again, the principle of sticking it to them. Well, the argument has been made is that there's not enough black quarterbacks in the NFL. Let's force every team to have a black quarterback. That'll be the NFL's reparations. And I think that professional sports was in serious trouble, again, because of scale. It has become so huge. It has become so ubiquitous. There's no escape from it. It was already in serious trouble before COVID-19 and the Black Intifada. I think we start seeing its death throes very quickly. And that goes for certainly for the NBA. Major League Baseball, a little different. Of course, there are very few American blacks in Major League Baseball. There are a lot of black players, but they don't come from the United States. They come from the Caribbean or from South America. And the reason for that is that black Americans have, by and large, decided they don't like baseball anymore, which is their choice. But doubtless, Major League Baseball is going to be under severe pressure to have more black Americans on the roster. And since they're, not going to cut their Caribbean players, that will mean fewer white players on the team. Hockey, very few people of color who play for the NHL. And I suppose there'll be a push to rectify that as well. I think the popularity of Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League rests upon the fact that to a very large extent, people look at the men playing the game, and they think they look like me. Well, they may decide to end that. I mean, you look at the NBA or the NFL, these people don't look like me, and it's not simply a matter of color. Because look at the linemen in the NFL. Oh, yeah, they weigh 360 pounds. Do they? No, they don't. They weigh closer to 400 pounds. These are behemoths. These are freaks. It's the same thing. It's the same thing in the NBA. I don't know. It's rather difficult for most people to identify with someone who is 7 feet tall. Free speech. We can have free speech of any kind for much longer. Alex Berenson, the COVID skeptic, who I've talked about many times on this show, He published a pamphlet, a little Kindle called Unreported Truth About COVID-19 and Lockdowns. And guess what? Amazon banned it. Amazon banned it. Now, they changed their mind. There was a lot of howling about it. And Elon Musk went after Jeff Bezos specifically because Amazon had banned Berenson's book. Oh, and I guess they're going to say that, an algorithm or something like that. But Berenson went looking, and it's, you don't have to look very far to find the kind of thing that Amazon is perfectly happy selling. From TechCrunch, Amazon defends sale of pedophile how-to guide. Earlier today, we reported that Amazon is selling a book called The Pedophile's Guide to Love and Pleasure. The book itself is a disgrace, a how-to guide for pedophiles. It includes, hang on a second here. It includes, among other things, tips on how to get away with it and how to avoid sexually transmitted diseases by purchasing condom-like products for children too small to use actual condoms. Regardless, Amazon will not remove the book from its store and has told us Amazon believes it is censorship not to sell certain books simply because we or others believe their message is objectionable. Amazon does not support or promote hatred or criminal acts. However, we do support the right of every individual to make their own purchasing decisions. So pedophilia, according to Amazon, perfectly okay. COVID-19 skepticism, no. But there was howling. And, a lot of people howl when a lot of people on the right have been banned from selling their books on Amazon. They don't have voices as powerful as Elon Musk. Let's see. The Notorious Anarchist Cookbook is a big bestseller on Amazon. That's a book that tells you how to make things that blow up. And for anarchists, like the people on the streets, burning down the streets of America right now. Michael Tracy, who I guess was a leftist, seems to be evolving. He wrote today about some black female reporter at The Intercept who was just screaming abuse at some Chinese fellow because he interviewed people about black on black crime, black on Asian crime, and she was hurt by this. Tracy wrote, his name is Fang. His colleagues are petrified of defending him publicly now, but L.H. Fang is one of the best journalists and analysts in America and has been for years. What's happening to him is disgusting and outrageous. He continues, the left liberal media world is demanding that journalists cease critical thinking and hand over their critical thinking faculties to others, because to not do so would be gravely offensive and possibly even violent. The left-wing activist media world, there is no real distinction between the two, increasingly operates like some kind of new age cult. There's plenty of cult-like behavior on the right as well, but these left-wing lunatics are culturally ascendant, and they are total lunatics. Thankfully, not everyone is a mindless racial reductionist. You should form a Journalists Against Critical Thought caucus, because that's the type of herd behavior you're exhibiting. It's disturbing that you have the power to craft political narratives. I should have mentioned this earlier. I don't want to leave it out. I think it's important. All of these true conservatives are wailing about Donald Trump appearing at first an Episcopal church holding a Bible and then at a Catholic church. Because this is horrible. This is hypocritical that Donald Trump, he's a well-known seducer, been married 3 times, doesn't go to church. Who was also a divorced president who was a well-known seducer and also didn't go to church? Ronald Reagan. Yeah, that's right. Ronald Reagan didn't attend church services. He said he was a religious man, but I guess it was an entirely private thing with him, and we don't know how deep it was. But the Reagan cult, they don't seem to care about that. Now, the New York Times, they published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, and their employees are not happy. Writers and staff of the New York Times have issued a rare but grating criticism for the publication after Senator Tom Cotton wrote an incendiary and fascist op-ed. You're supposed to put those words in quotations, okay? Calling for the use of military force against protesters. By the way, the National Guard are members of the military. So if a governor authorizes the use of the National Guard, a Democratic governor say, this is the military. This is the use of military force against protesters. But again, Schrodinger's cat, Democratic governor does it. It's not military force. It's something else, I suppose. The Republican senator from Arkansas took to his op-ed on Wednesday to call for the overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers from the various protests that spawned across the United States following the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Who's the second one? Okay. So, James Poniwozik tweeted, running this puts Black people, including Black New York Times staff, in danger. Yeah. We see this as an extension from human rights law, that someone reads a piece about immigration they don't like. Well, this is putting people in danger. Is it putting you in danger? No, I'm concerned about the people who are being put in danger. How does a piece calling for a reduction in immigration put anyone in danger? You just don't understand, do you? P.S. I want opinion sections to run op-eds, says Poniwozik. I disagree with. I love the New York Times and I'm proud to work for it. Running a piece that calls on the military to quell a protest against deadly racism. The riots aren't deadly, but racism is deadly. Is an injury to the newspaper and the colleagues who make me proud every day. Roxane Gay, who is famous for being, enormous. She wrote a memoir called Hungry. Running this puts Black New York Times writers, editors, and other staff in danger. How could that possibly be so? So let's imagine that New York Times employee is on the streets with the noble protesters. And so someone asks, where do y'all work? And he says, the New York Times. And then he says, get him! And they all swarm him, tear him to pieces. Is that what is supposed to happen? Yes, op-ed contributor Roxane Gay. As a New York Times writer, I absolutely stand in opposition to that Tom Cotton editorial, which is put in scare quotes. We are well served by robust and ideologically diverse public discourse that includes radical, liberal, and conservative voices. This is not that. His piece was inflammatory and endorsing military occupation as if the Constitution doesn't exist. Oh, this strange new respect from the Constitution. Amy Quinn, I guess another one of those model minorities I keep hearing about, tweeted, surreal and horrifying to wake up in the morning on June 4th, the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown, to this headline, Tom Cotton sent in the groups. Let me tell you something about Tiananmen Square. That the whole thing is a stitch up, all right? There's no way that those protesters would have been allowed on the streets of Beijing without powerful elements of the Communist Party supporting them. It's that simple. That, these brave people decided to take on the regime. That's not how it works in China. That's never how it has worked in China, and certainly not in the case of Tiananmen Square. Sewell Chan, another model minority, said, as a former New York Times op-ed editor, I am reluctant to weigh in on my alma mater. It falls short of sound journalistic practice. He just tweeted up a storm about this. Brian Schatz says he's a Hawaiian senator. I've submitted non-fascist opinion pieces to the Times in the past, but no luck, so maybe this is sour grapes. When people start calling you fascists, seriously, when people like Brian Schatz, U.S. Senator Brian Schatz, start calling people fascists, what that means is they want to hurt you. They want you imprisoned and perhaps killed. Keep this in mind. Of course, Sarah Zhang, yeah, we all know about her. Another model minority weighs in against her employer. Taylor Lawrence says, running this puts Black New York Times staff in danger. Don't write or say anything that could possibly be seen to offend Black people, because you will get in trouble. You're hurting them. You're putting them in danger. From the New York Post, Philadelphia Inquirer journalists walk out over buildings matter too. Headline. Yeah. On June 4th, we called in sick and tired, stated a letter signed by at least 44 journalists of color of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Sick and tired of pretending things are okay. The carelessness of our leadership makes it harder to do our jobs, and at worst, puts our lives at risk. The headline, comparing the vandalism to buildings to the international outrage sparked by deaths in police custody, appeared on page 12 of Wednesday's print edition. We should not have printed it, the paper's editors wrote in an apology to our readers and Inquirer employees. You know what? What they should have said was, oh, you don't like it here? Well, you're not compelled to work here. We understand why you would no longer work for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we wish you well in your search for new employment. Yeah, like, good luck finding a job in the media in this climate. I'm going to wrap it up. Well, no, that's one last thing here. From Toby Young, Lockdown Skeptics. And he writes, as readers of the site will know, I resent the fact that dissenters from COVID orthodoxy, including me, are often labeled conspiracy theorists. For instance, if we give any credence to the hypothesis that SARS-CoV-2 originated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology as opposed to a wet market, we're accused of disseminating fake news or trafficking in misinformation, or to use the WHO's phrase, contributing to an infodemic. And that makes us a danger to the public, apparently. But those same custodians of what is and isn't acceptable for people to read don't seem to be nearly so circumspect when it comes to the claims of Black Lives Matter activists, even though the narrative they're promoting in its most extreme form is a conspiracy theory. I don't mean the claim that young Black men in America, or Britain for that matter, are the victims of racial prejudice. That's not a conspiracy theory, obviously. I mean the more specific claim that the U.S. criminal justice system is riddled with systemic institutional racism. That may have been true 50 years ago and may have been true in some U.S. states as recently as 25 years ago, but the evidence that it is still true today is pretty threadbare. As the African-American social scientist Roland Fryer has pointed out, when it comes to extreme use of force, officer-involved shootings, Blacks and Hispanics are no more likely to be shot than whites in similar circumstances. As for racist white police officers being responsible for the systemic murder of young Black men, a 2018 study for the Public Administration Review found that white officers are no more likely to use lethal force on minority suspects than minority officers. In fact, a 2015 Justice Department analysis of the Philadelphia Police Department found that white police officers were less likely than Black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed suspects. Again, it's good for us to know the truth. But just keep in mind that people on the other side, they don't care about truth because they have a myth. Jim Smith says, this has become the ultimate in political correctness and it's just as sickening as you can imagine. Oh, we've gone far beyond political correctness. You know, when James Fields was convicted in a kangaroo court of first-degree murder, despite the evidence that everyone had seen, he was going to be made a sacrifice. You know, now he's a rape toy for prisoners. And the left delights in this sort of thing. Keep that in mind as well. So a final look at the chat. Rustin Shackelford says, how do natives regain our strength? 2024 is looking bad. GOP establishment is suppressing populists, and it doesn't look like there's another populist billionaire out there. You know, I've been trying to suggest that the traditional modes of politics on the right have failed. Trump won because he wasn't using those traditional modes. And I suppose a good rule of thumb is, if you look at things that conservatives have said over the decades, what they keep going back to, their talking points, just throw them out of the window because they're useless. But he says, Kevin, were you ever an Expos fan? No. I remember watching their first game. What was that, in 1969? They beat the New York Mets. That was the year the Mets won the World Series. It's a wild game. No, I was a Toronto Blue Jays fan. But baseball is doing its best to push me away, particularly this rubbish about Jackie Robinson every year. You'd think that Jackie Robinson had invented baseball, or you'd think that he was a better player than, I don't know, Babe Ruth. Apparently baseball was nothing until Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a great player, and he's in the Hall of Fame, but he's not the be-all and end-all of Major League Baseball. Ricardo Williams says, I will say that the literal copy-paste nature of these corporate statements suggests that they are not sincere, more afraid of blowback than generally supported. Well, I don't know. There's a kind of sincerity that comes out of fear, and I think that is part of it. The Criterion Collection, I would guess that if you want to talk about Black purchase of Criterion Collection movies, I'm going to say 1 in 100 or less. That would be my guess. Did you watch? I did watch the Blue Jays in the 80s, particularly their collapse against the Detroit Tigers. Anyway, Dawn from Beyond says freedom of association is key, and then we can experiment with creating various visionary communities. I didn't mention it, but there's a fascinating essay today by the Z-Man on his blog where he talks about the total death of privacy. And freedom of association is going to become very difficult indeed with this complete death of privacy. I suppose one of the things he suggests is if you're going out to meet fellow thinkers, don't take your cell phone with you. That way you can't be tracked. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, and we will be discussing Timothy Weiner's book, Legacy of Ashes, about the CIA. Excellent, excellent book, based entirely on real sources, not anonymous sources. There's not a single anonymous source in the book. Admirable journalism. And if you like today's show, or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support the show, and I'd very much appreciate it, especially considering my current circumstances, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Again, that is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you now with my traditional benediction and farewell in these days of total social atomization and with the sack of Rome going on outside your windows. I do hope that you all manage to find some genuine human connection. Good night.